Hockey is brutal. Players crash into each other at full speed, take pucks to the body, and battle through injuries that would send most people to the hospital. But every once in a while, something happens that goes way beyond a tough hit or a broken bone. These are the moments where lives are on the line. Take Richard Zednik, for example. It was February 10th, 2008, and the Florida Panthers were facing off against the Buffalo Sabres. The game was intense, but nothing out of the ordinary until a freak accident changed everything. Late in the third period, Zednik's teammate Olli Jokinen lost his balance in a collision. As he fell, his skate swung up and sliced Zednik's neck. It happened so fast that for a split second, no one reacted. Then, blood started pouring on the ice. Zednik grabbed his throat and somehow skated toward the bench, leaving a trail of blood behind him. He had no idea how bad it was, but the medical staff did. His carotid artery, one of the main vessels supplying blood to the brain, was hanging by a thread. He had already lost nearly 40% of his blood. If the cut had been just a little deeper, he wouldn't have made it. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, where doctors performed emergency surgery. The odds were against him, but he survived, and somehow, just 10 months later, he was back on the ice. That was a terrifying moment, but at least Zednik was conscious when it happened. Rich Peverley never even saw it coming. It was March 10th, 2014, and he was playing for the Dallas Stars in a game against the Columbus Blue Jackets. He had just finished a shift and returned to the bench when he suddenly slumped over. No contact, no warning. His heart had simply stopped. His teammates started banging their sticks on the boards to get the trainer's attention. Medical staff jumped into action and dragged Peverley to the locker room. His heart wasn't beating, and they knew every second mattered. They started CPR immediately, then hit him with a defibrillator. One shock, and his heart restarted. He woke up, confused, looking around, then asked, "When can I get back out there?" But that was it. His career was over. Doctors told him the damage to his heart was too severe and playing again wasn't an option. That night, the game was postponed, only the second time in NHL history that had ever happened. But Peverley wasn't the first NHL player to suffer cardiac arrest during a game. Yuri Fischer lived through it too. But his situation was even more terrifying. It was November 21st, 2005, and Fischer was on the bench during a game for the Detroit Red Wings. One moment, he was watching the play. The next, he was collapsing. His body started convulsing, and he turned blue right in front of his teammates. Panic spread instantly. Players and coaches started yelling for help as team doctor Tony Colucci sprinted to the bench. He cut open Fischer's jersey and immediately began CPR. His heart wasn't beating. For 6 full minutes, Fischer was clinically dead. The only reason he survived was because an AED, a defibrillator, was available. One shock brought him back. Doctors later discovered that Fischer had an undiagnosed heart condition. His heart was abnormally large, and the risk of another episode was too high. He never played another NHL game, but what happened to him forced the league to change its safety protocols. Now, every NHL arena is required to have an AED, and since then, at least a dozen lives have been saved because of it. Then, there was Trent McCleary. On January 29, 2000, he was playing for the Montreal Canadiens against the Philadelphia Flyers. Late in the second period, Flyers defenseman Chris Therien fired a slap shot from the blue line. McCleary did what he always did. He dropped to block it, but instead of hitting his pads, the puck struck him directly in the throat. The force of the impact shattered his larynx, the structure that protects the airway and the vocal cords. His right lung collapsed, and blood started flooding into his throat. McCleary tried to stand, but he couldn't breathe. His body was shutting down fast. He stumbled toward the bench and collapsed. Doctors had no time to wait for an ambulance. Right there in the arena hallway, they performed an emergency tracheotomy, cutting his throat with a pocket knife and using a pen casing as a makeshift breathing tube. That quick decision saved his life. At the hospital, surgeons worked to repair the damage, but his airway had become so narrow that breathing at full intensity would never be the same. Even though he had a contract for the next season, McCleary retired months later. He had no regrets. He had built his career on sacrifice, and he'd do it all over again. But sometimes, even the strongest players don't get a choice. Just ask Chris Pronger. It was May 10th, 1998. Game 2 of the Western Conference semifinals between the St. Louis Blues and the Detroit Red Wings. Pronger, a rising star on the Blues' defense, was in perfect position when a slap shot from Dmitry Mironov came flying toward him. The puck struck him just to the left of his sternum. At first, it didn't seem like much. He skated forward, took 2 strides, then collapsed. His body hit the ice, face first. His eyes rolled back, and for 30 seconds he didn't move. His heart had stopped. The impact had triggered commotio cordis, a rare condition where a blunt hit to the chest disrupts the heart's rhythm at the exact wrong millisecond. Survival rates for this are shockingly low. Without immediate CPR and a defibrillator, most victims don't make it. Somehow, Pronger's heart restarted and he was rushed to the hospital. When he woke up, he didn't ask what had happened, he asked when he could play again. Against medical advice, he was back on the ice just 72 hours later, logging over 41 minutes of ice time in Game 3. Looking back, he admitted he had no memory of anything after taking that shot. It was pure instinct. Years later, after watching NFL player Damar Hamlin suffer a similar cardiac arrest on the field, Pronger spoke out about the importance of emergency medical response. "You don't get second chances with your heart," he said. But sometimes, it's not just the heart you have to worry about. Ryan Johnson learned that the hard way. On October 27, 2009, the Vancouver Canucks were playing the Detroit Red Wings. Johnson was a relentless player, known for his speed and toughness. That night, he chased a puck into the offensive zone, trying to beat legendary defenseman Nicklas Lidstrom to it. But just as he made his move, his skate caught a rut in the ice. In an instant, he was launched forward, completely out of control. At nearly 20 miles per hour, he crashed head first into the boards. The impact snapped his neck forward at a terrifying angle. The entire arena went silent. Players stood frozen, watching as Johnson lay motionless on the ice. Trainers rushed over, fearing the worst: spinal trauma, paralysis, or even worse. They stabilized his neck and stretchered him off. Scans later revealed he had suffered a severe concussion and deep bruising in his spine, but somehow no fractures. Experts say headfirst collisions at that speed can generate over 1,000 pounds of force, more than enough to snap vertebrae. Johnson had defied the odds, but the toll on his body was undeniable. He returned weeks later, only to break his foot twice that season while blocking shots. By 2011, repeated concussions forced him to retire. Today, he speaks out about concussion safety, calling his 2009 crash a warning the league didn't take seriously enough. And sometimes, the game pushes players to the edge of survival. Take what happened to Ted Green in 1969. It was a preseason game between the Boston Bruins and St. Louis Blues, and things were getting heated. Green, a tough-as-nails defenseman, took a swing at Blues forward Wayne Mackey with his stick. Mackey didn't hesitate. He swung back, hard. His stick connected with Green's skull right at the temple. Green dropped instantly. His body started convulsing, and he could barely speak. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors found a depressed skull fracture, meaning a piece of his skull had caved in. He needed emergency surgery to relieve the pressure on his brain. It took 4.5 hours, and even as he was being wheeled in, he was muttering about getting revenge. He missed the entire season, including Boston's Stanley Cup run. When he finally returned, he wasn't the same. The aggression that made him one of the league's most feared defensemen was gone. His career continued for years, but the titanium plate in his head was a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. The aftermath of the incident was just as shocking. Both Green and Mackey were charged with assault, the first time NHL players had ever faced criminal prosecution for on-ice violence. In the end, a jury let them walk, citing hockey's unwritten rules. The NHL gave Mackey a 30-game suspension, but it wasn't enough to stop stick-swinging incidents from happening again. That was an all-out brawl, but sometimes danger comes out of nowhere. That's what happened to Ondrej Pavelec in 2010. It was just 2 minutes into the season opener for the Atlanta Thrashers when Pavelec suddenly collapsed. He wasn't hit, he didn't trip, he just fell backward and lay motionless on the ice. For over 15 minutes, no one knew if he was alive. The entire arena went silent as trainers rushed to his side. Paramedics gave him oxygen before loading him onto a stretcher. When he woke up in the hospital, he had no memory of what happened. Doctors ran every test they could think of before diagnosing him with a neurocardiogenic syncope, a condition where the body randomly drops blood pressure, causing sudden fainting. It wasn't his head injury from the fall that caused it, his own body just shut down without warning. 3 weeks later, he was back in net. But things were different. He later admitted that every game after that came with a new fear, the fear of collapsing again. He still managed to carve out a long career, but his sudden blackout remains one of hockey's strangest medical emergencies. Then there was Damon Langkow. His injury was different. It was a moment that every hockey player dreads. March 21st, 2010. The Calgary Flames were playing the Minnesota Wild when a slap shot fired by Greg Zanin struck Langkow directly in the back of the neck. The puck was moving over 90 miles per hour. Langkow dropped to the ice and didn't move. His teammates surrounded him as trainers worked frantically to stabilize his spine. He was stretchered off, and everyone feared the worst. Doctors found that the puck had fractured his C6 vertebrae and bruised his spinal cord. If the impact had been just a little higher, he could have been paralyzed, or worse. He missed the rest of the season, then sat out an entire year trying to recover. It took intense rehab, but he finally returned in 2011, logging over 15 minutes of ice time in his first game back. He wasn't the same player after that, but just making it back onto the ice was a miracle in itself. Hockey is unpredictable, and these near-death moments are just a glimpse of how dangerous the game can be. If you want more shocking NHL stories, make sure to subscribe and check out our next video. You won't believe what else has happened on the ice.